Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. You are all welcome to this webinar on Black Lives Matter, structural racism, bigotry, and inclusion. In the wake of George Foreman's death and the thousands of Black Lives Matter protests that have taken place around the world, much of the recent national, international conversation has centered around the issues of racism, responsibility, and structural privilege. But as many of us seek to actively enact anti-racism in our daily lives, be it in church, in schools, in homes, one concept has become especially important as a topic in conversation, and that is structural racism, an emotive and sensitive issue that actually always results in very painful discussion. And however difficult or painful it is, I'm reminded of what Maya Angelou said about facing our history and what is happening even in the present. I quote, "History, despite its ranging pain, cannot be unlived, but faced with courage, need not to be lived again." And in other words, and she continues with some very hopeful words again, Maya Angelou, talking about that part of inclusion aspect. Says, quote, "Despite diversity makes for a rich tapestry, we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are in equal value, no matter their color, equal in importance, no matter their texture," end of quote. In other words, this statement reminds me of what is sometimes generally said in many quarters, and an observation which sometimes also has perhaps some legal basis, that respect for everybody is presumptuous. Always we have thought of it as something that is earned. Respect is not earned. People are respected because they are human. Once we ask that people respect us and we say you have to earn it, then there is going to be some problems. But we respect people because they are human. The racism has become a very emotive issue, and why it is, what's the role of it, before just to introduce that subject. Because investing in racism provides with resources, power, and opportunity. It has a cash value, it has a power value, and hence it becomes a very important thing. It's a central organizing tenet of our lives in ways sometimes that we don't want to acknowledge. Race shapes and affects how we live, how we worship, which churches we attend, what kind of jobs we do, school we attend, food we eat, how we see each other, how communities are organized. It affects our safety, our health, our property, and determines the present and future of our children and the generations to come. As such, race then is a very important organizing feature. Indeed, as Cornel West observed in his book by this title, Race Matters, and as Eduardo Bonilla Silva observed in his book, Racism, which is entitled Racism Without Racists, he observes in chapter 10, which I think, in chapter 10, says race matters in Obama America, but it's talking about the centrality of race. And as George also in his subtitle, how people profit from identity politics, states that race is a cultural construct, but one that is deadly, and with deadly social causes and the consequences. To help us unpack this phenomenon, which must be first as part of the history today, we have three panelists who I'm going to introduce to us in order. They are going to help us in the order that I'm going to introduce them to unpack this phenomenon that has been so central and continues to be central to our lives. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Afua Cooper, who is a professor of Black Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie University. She is also the director of the Black People's History of Canada project and holds a Killam research chair. Afua was recently appointed the Canadian UNESCO representative for the United Nations Slave Route, depending on where we are. The second speaker is going to be Dr. Samukele Hadebe, who is currently a visiting fellow at the Chris Hanna Institute, Johannesburg, researching on worker education and labor issues. He was the director of the Center for Public Engagement after a stint as a senior civil servant, and he taught in the Department of African Languages and Literature at the University of Zimbabwe. The last speaker, but not the least, is Dr. Adam Muller, who is a director of the Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs at the University of Manitoba, Canada, and a founding member of the Global Consortium on Bigotry and Hate. He researches and teaches on the artistic representation of genocide, war, and human rights. We'll now give the opportunity to Dr. Cooper to do the presentation, after which they'll present for 15 minutes each, up to 15 minutes each. And then we'll open it up for questions, which will be on the chat.
Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you for the invitation. And thanks to all my co-panelists and everyone who is involved in making this project happen, and to all members of our virtual audience. I am going to share my screen now. I think I need to click on share my screen first, right? And I think it's this one, and then I have to do something like that and go to the top. Okay, so I'm gonna begin by looking at the case of Canada, this issue of racism, of systemic or structural racism, and how it impacts us in Canada. And I'm going to speak on one particular issue. There are a number of issues I can speak on, but in the interest of time, I will focus on criminal justice. It's certainly a topic that has roiled the Black community for decades. It has impacted our lives, policing, court matters, incarceration. And as Dr. Kim said, this has been brought more to the fore now in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd, which happened last year, the murder last year in May in Minneapolis. On the international stage, Canada is seen as a site of goodness, politeness, and mercy, as a place where slavery did not exist, and racism and anti-Black racism did not occur, anti-Black racism in particular. Oftentimes when we think of slavery, we think of the United States. Canada is often contrasted with the United States with its racism, police brutality, and cruelty towards Blacks. When Ontario premiers Doug Ford, for example, noted recently that race relations in the US and Canada are like night and day, and he hopes that the US can, quote unquote, straighten out its problems, he epitomized how Canada continues to ignore its deep-seated structural racism. And we also know that François Legault, the premier of Quebec, also said the same thing, that there was no structural racism in Quebec. Ford's denial of Canada's anti-Black racism renders our experience of it invisible, whereas police killings constitute part of a steady diet fed to Black Canadians. Canada's history includes the same institutionalized enslavement of Africans, beginning with its pre-Confederation French and British colonial regimes. Yet slavery has been excised from its historical chronicles and erased from its memory. After legal emancipation in 1834, the shadow of slavery continued to loom over Black lives as whites reinscribed an established social order based on white supremacy and Black inferiority. Canada's racial hierarchy manifested in segregated communities, schools, churches, cemeteries, and places of entertainment. In some jurisdictions, Black people were denied the franchise because of the color of their skin. They likewise faced restrictive employment opportunities and were the targets of police harassment on unjust court decisions. As I've said, I'm just going to be focusing on the issue of criminal justice and police interfacing with the Black community under 5 main rubrics: street checks and racial profiling. In the United States, it's called stop and frisk. Black people as victims of police violence, Black people receiving longer prison and jail sentences, the whole issue of mass incarceration and hate crime. The issue of Black interaction, the issue of police interaction with Black community members, much of it fatal for Black people involved, much of it fatal for the Black people involved, has been a sore point for decades. Police killings of Black men in particular have now become normalized. In the past 40 plus years, young Black men in major Canadian municipalities have been shot or beaten to death. And I don't need to go over this point anymore. We know the statistics for people who don't know. A simple Google search can yield results in that regard. Some of the names over the years: Buddy Evans, Michael Wade Lawson. These are people who were shot and killed by police. Sophia Cook, a young woman who was injured. Marla Neal, Raymond Lawrence, Clifford Cooley. In more recent times, Junior Alexander Manon, DeAndre Campbell, Frank Anthony Berry, Eric Osawa, Alex Whitlaufer, and on and on and on. The issue of street checks or racial profiling. In 2019, the Halifax Regional Police released for its 2006 and 2007 period, which noted that Black men were 9 times street checked more than white men, even though Black men represent only 1.8% of Halifax's population. The Black female street check rate was even higher than that for white men. And in Toronto, 27% of all carding victims are Black. You can look at this report from the Disparate Impact, which was put out last year by Ontario Human Rights Commission, and also in 2019 by the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. Street checks affect the employment opportunities for Black people and have led to injuries and lost lives. Racial profiling led to the killings of Jermaine Carby, Junior Alexander Manon, and the wounding of Sophia Cook. Street checks treat Black people like second-class citizens and have antecedents in past codes, Black codes, past laws, slave laws, and sundown laws, statutes designed to regulate and control Black bodies during and after slavery. It racially profiles Black people and contravenes their rights under Canada's Charter of Human Rights and Freedom. Now, this is from this data that I'm now presenting is from a Disparate Impact. And I urge people to look at that report. If we were talking about anti-Black racism in the age of Black Lives Matter, what does it mean for people living, Black people living in some of our major Canadian municipalities, like Toronto, for example? We know that Black people, especially Black men, are nearly 20 times as likely to be shot dead in an interaction with the police, 6 times more likely to be taken down by a police dog. I want people to cast your minds back to slavery, even though none of us were enslaved. But you know, we know that the dogs, the hound dogs, were used to track and capture and sometimes killed enslaved people who ran away from slavery. And today we are still coming up against police dogs. Police in municipalities across Canada are still using dogs to take down people, especially Black people. And even though Black people make up only 8% of Toronto's population. The issue of mass incarceration is a sore point. And I'm gonna read a note here from a magazine called The Torontoist. And the article is called Canada Has a Black Incarceration Problem. And this was published April 21st, 2016. Last month, federal prison watchdog Howard Sapers presented his annual report in Parliament. This is a federal parliament, detailing the demographics and conditions within our federal prisons. After 10 years on the job, Sapers wasn't surprised to find that the number of Black inmates increased yet again. Since he started in 2005, he has never seen a year where the Black population in federal prisons didn't rise. Overall, during his tenure, Sapers has watched the number of Black inmates grow by 69%. Black Canadians now represent the fastest growing group in federal prisons and are vastly overrepresented behind bars. While African Canadians make up 3% of the general population, they account for 10% of the federal prison population. The report also indicates that while in prison, Black inmates are overrepresented in segregation, that is solitary confinement, and that they are subject to nearly 15% of all use of force incidents. In a case study released in 2014 on the Black inmate experience, the officer of the correctional investigator points out that despite being rated as a population having a lower risk to reoffend and lower need overall, Black inmates are more likely to be placed in maximum security institutions. And I just want to say that Black people are also overrepresented in arrest statistics. And of course, this feeds into the mass incarceration issue that we're talking about. The deceased Black activist Dudley Laws made a statement many years ago for which he paid dearly. And he said that Black people lived in communities that are occupied by the police, that Black people lived under police occupation. And after he made that statement, he was subjected to all kinds of harassments by the Toronto police. On the issue of hate crimes, Statistics Canada 2013 and StatsCan also just released the hate crime statistics for last year. But I'm giving you the 2013 stats, but the stats for last year reveal the same thing, that fully 44% of hate crimes reported were directed towards Black individuals. Now, how do we go for inclusion? What do we do? And I want to say that Black people have been the principal agents in the quest, their quest, or our quest for human rights, for the quest for accountability. Black people have been at the forefront in demanding that the police institutions, the police services be defunded. The Toronto Police, for example, has a budget of over $1 billion. The New York Police Department has a budget of over $6 billion. And Black communities have been bearing the brunt of police violence, as I've stated. But again, on the question of agency, Black people have been at the forefront. If you look at the reports that were published by the various human rights commission across Canada, if you look at these reports were initiated by the Black community. If you look at institutions like Black North Initiative, the Canadian Federation of Black People, there's the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and these institutions or organizations rather have taken the whole issue of anti-Black racism seriously and have been pressuring governments at all levels and civil society, not only to take anti-Black racism seriously, but also to bring about initiatives that will ensure that we all live in this in a just society. In 2017, the United Nations sent their working group to Canada, and this working group traveled to several municipalities across the country. And the head of the panel, he said, in our conversation with African Canadians, we found that Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization has had a deleterious impact on people of African descent, which must be addressed in partnership with African Canadian communities. He notes that Black people are among the poorest in Canada, and the UN working group gave several recommendations to the federal government, which can be grouped under these five rubrics, if you will. The UN working group asked the Canadian federal government to apologize for slavery and consider reparations, discontinue the practice of street checks and other forms of racial profiling, address anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system, collect data that is by race, color, ethnic background, and national origins, and create a National Department of African Canadian Affairs to represent the interests of Black Canadians. And I will stop there for now. I want to say this issue of structural racism or systemic racism, especially as it pertains to Black people, is beyond serious. We have seen how anti-Black racism now intersects with the COVID-19 situation that we are now experiencing in Canada. And we have seen how anti-Black racism and COVID-19 actually meet on the backs of Black people in this country, because Black people are disproportionately impacted by the fallout of COVID-19. So, hopefully I have put the problem out there, and I have come up or articulated some ways in which the problems can be addressed. And I also want to say that the problem is being addressed, especially by members of the Black community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Afua. And now we will give the floor to Dr. Hadebe.
Thank you, Prof. Kim Sibanda. Thank you, organizers of this webinar and all panelists.
I really appreciate the presentation by Dr. Professor Cooper, and I enjoyed the presentation, though it's very touching. But my presentation focuses on the global South, with specific reference to the countries of Southern Africa, Zimbabwe in particular, and South Africa, where I do my trade as a worker there. When I listened to the presentation by Dr. Cooper, and I said, but the experiences of Blacks in the global North aren't different from the experiences of us here in Africa, where we are not in the minority numerically, where politically we are enjoying the political majority. So the question of my discussion is, perhaps some might question to say, is there structural racism in the area of your focus, where perhaps Blacks are in charge of their lives? And my talk is to reveal that the same experiences, more or less the same experiences of Blacks in the global North are just repeated in the global South. So in a way, I would say that racism is pervasive, though it is not always overt in its manifestation. But we know that whenever there is a manifestation of racist abuse or racist violence in a manner that attracts media attention and publicity, most often society expresses shock and an outpouring of condemnations against racism, bigotry, and prejudice. But inadvertently, two impressions are created by this. Firstly, that incidences of racism are isolated eruptions from a few members of society in the fringe. And secondly, perhaps that mainstream society not only upholds racism, but that it stands ready to eliminate it whenever it rears its ugly head. Unfortunately, it would seem that such assumptions, which are really dominant, tend to inform and constitute the dominant ideas in society, notwithstanding the lived experiences of Black people in particular, and the dominated people in general, who bear witness to structural racism, bigotry, and systematic exclusion. Of course, it has been through these rare cases that attract media attention and media publicity that the ongoing anti-racism campaigns following, for instance, the callous murder of George Floyd by a white police officer, that amplified the many voices against racism, but significantly by the Black Lives Matter movement, which we are all grateful for its work and how it has really amplified the voice against racism. Not only did that unfortunate occurrence lead to debates on racism and police violence, but also on racism at the workplace, which is the area of my interest from the labor point. But this racism is not manifest only at workplaces in labor, but we also see it in football. There are cases now, research is reflecting how Black players, especially in football, but in other sporting areas, are subject to racist attacks, stereotypes, and abuses. But we also see instances of racism in education, in media, and in various spheres of life. So my focus is therefore on the manifestations of the racial ideology and the labor in the global South, with a particular focus on Southern Africa, as I've said. And I'll briefly give you a context, because people would say, but how do you talk of racism in an area where 99% of people are all Blacks, they are running their affairs? Where does this racism come from? So it's important to give you a context so that we see how the lives of the Black people in the global North as well as the global South experiences almost the same features of racial discrimination and racial violence. I would say without exception, the countries that today constitute in Southern Africa, you can name Angola, you can name South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, Lesotho, Eswatini, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, my own country, were territorially carved by imperialist European powers at the height of economic plunder and dispossession of the continent, which was justified and accompanied by an ideology of racist superiority on the part of the conqueror. So from the onset, racial discrimination was pursued through legislation, through policies, through education, through church, religion, through media, and all spheres of life. So the complete decolonization of these countries, which now we are all nominally politically independent. However, that independence has not addressed the structural inequalities that most often follow social, class, and racial lines. So it's important to understand why we still have this pervasive racism in a situation where so much change has happened politically. So we have to trace it back to perhaps what we can say the source of the racist ideology, which was slavery and colonialism, and this region equally suffered those two sketches. So the colonial system across the board in this region, it ensured that the then ruling whites monopolized economic control by exclusively owning mines, factories, best agricultural land, controlling trade and commerce, and the blacks could only offer their cheap labor as they were perceived to be lesser humans that had to be denied basic human rights, including citizenship rights, like the right to vote. While the independence, the coming of political independence has changed a lot of things, still some remain the same. The economic power relations still excluded the majority who are black. The laws, the education system, and the dominant ideas generally reflect and reinforce the colonially established relations of racial and ethnic hierarchies in terms of access to political and economic power. Racism in this part of the world was not just between the color divide, but even amongst the blacks, there were hierarchies depending on ethnicities. And the legacy of that thinking and hierarchies has been seen in nation building and how fragile most of the states are because of the continuities from that past that is refusing to go or to change with times. So it would seem that this racial template, which is guiding policy making, hardly changed. But what one can say is that there was a swapping of race for ethnicity. So some of the problems that sometimes we perceive as the problem of ethnicity is just the same template of how the colonial setup had been set and has continued post independence. So blacks continue to suffer racial and ethnic violence and discrimination from their state. The fear of the police officers is still the same, whether it was in colonial, whether it was like in apartheid South Africa, whether it was under the Portuguese rule in Mozambique or Angola, or in Namibia or in Zimbabwe, Zambia. It still persists in many cases, and cases of police violence is still rife. And one says, why is this the case? Then unless we can contextualize it in the history of inherited and the structural inequalities and that racial ideology template that continues post-liberation, it will be difficult to understand why certain things remain as they are. For instance, if one would just sift through the newspapers in the region, it is common to find government ministers boasting that police must shoot to kill, and they do. So, or you hear government ministers talking about soldiers deployed in civilian areas, that they are not for a picnic, but to do business, by doing business, meaning to kill. And those are some of the issues that you ask yourself and say, but this is the killing that characterized colonial Africa, but it still persists post independence. And the question is why? So when we look at the issues of ethnic cleansing and issues of genocide that have persisted post-independence, we know there are cases now recently, the acknowledgement of the genocide in colonial Namibia, but we have other cases of genocide that are yet to be acknowledged in colonial times. But post-independence, we've had the region also having cases of ethnic cleansing and the genocide. And we can't separate those and say, this is a different template. We should see the continuity in the framework that was established during the colonial conquest. So this, from a labor point, which I'm coming from, we should also see the issue of inequalities, because one of the issues we are pressing with in the region are issues of inequalities, and they've been persistent. The division between, for instance, urban and rural, which resembles the colonial setup where there was the center and the periphery. The center not just being the metropole, which could have been London or Lisbon or Paris, but it also within the region. For instance, in Southern African context, which is my area of focus, South Africa has played the role of an economic regional center of capital, while the rest of the countries like Lesotho, Eswatini, Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia provide cheap labor. It has been the case for 300, 500 years ago. It is still the case now, even if political independence has been attained. So that context has to be seen to see how structural racism pans out in this region. So due to a number of factors, but most importantly, historical and contemporary ones, we have seen an increase in cross-border labor migration, which is my interest because that's where the manifestation of this discrimination comes out clearly. And this migration has always been towards the center, and most being the Johannesburg city of South Africa, but other cities as well. And due to a number of factors, including issues of trade liberalization, deregulation, that led to massive job losses, you realize that post-independence, many countries in the region, job insecurity increased, so labor had to move, and in most cases it moved towards South Africa. But unfortunately, this liberalization regime, which encouraged governments to open up their countries for free flow of imports and unlimited repatriation of profits, did not do the same with human movement. Instead, it encouraged the tightening of border controls and instituting strong anti-immigration laws, resulting in a flood of migrant workers who become undocumented, and in the process, they get criminalized. And hence, we experience these incessant flares of the xenophobic attacks on migrants, particularly targeting migrant workers from poorer countries. So this hierarchy of groups based on racial and ethnicity categorization partly accounts for targeting of certain immigrants, while not all immigrants are targeted. For instance, an immigrant from the global north with a fair hair color would not be considered a risk or target for xenophobia. So the victimized are labeled either as the dangerous thieves, or as prostitutes, or as drug traffickers, or as carriers of disease, though research and evidence has not proven the same, but still these descriptors are used against Blacks whenever they are racially abused, even in the global north. So unfortunately, this same treatment Blacks suffer in the global south is not different when they are treated with disdain as displaced people. You know, you see the media showing blacks crossing the Mediterranean and the like, those images that are also demeaning, they are dehumanizing, described as the job seekers, you're described as the displaced people, refugees, all those terms, you get the sense of their dehumanizing aspect. And we have no doubt that this racial template remains the same from the colonial one, with the negative stereotypes, and hence fighting structural racism and bigotry should be approached from that broad spectrum. It is not confined to cases that have been well researched, as the present panelists have presented so eloquently, but you can see that it runs across. And when the movement of the Black Lives Matter, it resonated well with the people of the Global South. Why? Because the experiences that were being articulated were exactly the same as the experience that the majority are feeling in their countries, even after decolonization. So what could be some of the ways in which these could be mitigated, or ways of fighting racism and bigotry? Of course, the subject matter under discussion already posited the issue of inclusion, which, if appropriately implemented, could drastically curtail racism, which is the true miseries of the human race. Since racism spreads and permeates society largely because it is ingrained in laws, in policies, in the education systems, and many other spheres of life, uprooting it must not be left to chance or to individual choice. In my view, it must be a deliberate change by many stakeholders, but most importantly, governments, through changing the laws, the policies, particularly on education, on migration, and employment practices that keep other people disadvantaged and reduced to the margins of economic activity. Since it is not in the habit of governments to change policies for altruistic purposes, that is where faith organizations should come in. That is where labor organizations should come in, and many other human rights groups who should unite and push for legislative and policy changes, as well as budgets to improve the welfare of the marginalized groups, especially in improving access to education, access to housing, and employment opportunities, since these are some of the ways in which the dignity could be restored when people at least have a job, a decent housing, and appropriate education. That way, I believe that labor can be a powerful agent to push for this change. Labor in the region especially has had a crucial role, including in the liberation struggle, as well as in the democratization struggle. And we believe that that role can also be pivotal in the fight against structural racism, which affects actually the majority of the working people. So action-based advocacy is likely to yield more positive results beyond awareness raising. It's important to raise awareness, but it's important to couple that awareness raising with action so that at least there is a move towards the change that is desired. It is important also to identify also areas of intervention where inclusion could be strengthened, and in the process where communities could build cohesion and participation, especially in our context, the migrant communities and the local communities, as it were. So the education system could play a better role in promoting a culture of diversity, not just in the composition of participants in terms of perhaps educators and like, but also in the knowledge production too. Because one of the problems that we realize is that notwithstanding the changes that have taken place, there is still a problem in knowledge production, that knowledge is still produced in the same way with the bias that was inherited from the colonial setup, and hence these disparities that continue years after political independence. Lastly, it is important also to record and collect data on incidents of racial violence, abuse, and discrimination, and they are very prevalent in this region, notwithstanding the numbers of the racial equilibrium, but you can still feel that the dominant group, regardless of numerical strength, is dominant because of the economic power and the power of the laws and the power of the policies, or just the power of the establishment. If I can cite perhaps the study on a commentary which men could have read on the FIFA World Cup in 2018, which found that Black players were overwhelmingly praised for their perceived physical prowess and natural athleticism, while white players and were praised for their intelligence and character. Such covert racism could escape attention of many unless it is exposed by research. In Zimbabwe, for instance, there are cases, especially in sports like cricket, sports like rugby, where this racist problem, the stereotype, still made, and it has affected game. But it does happen in a number of countries, as research shows. In my conclusion, perhaps let me quote Professor Anita Jackson of Kent University, who says, racism is so ingrained in the US society at all levels. To not be a racist, one must be an active anti-racist. By recognizing the systems in place in society that limit others and by striving to bring change. If one is not actively striving for more equitable policies for all people, regardless of race, then one is a racist, close quote. Perhaps I may add to these profound words that racism is ingrained not only in US society, but in all societies, as just demonstrated from my reference to Southern Africa. And it remains anchored in the colonial and slavery thinking that justified the dispossession, subjugation, and the dehumanization of Blacks. I thank you.
Thank you so kindly, Dr. Hadebe, Samukele, as we say, for it. Now we will give the floor to Dr. Muller.
Thanks very much, Kim. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I wanted to thank also the other panelists. I very much appreciated your remarks. And I think there are a number of interesting points of contact between what you both said and what I'm about to say, although the frame I'm using is a slightly different one, a slightly broader one. Also like to thank the members of the G20 Interfaith Forum for supporting a discussion like this, which obviously has a great deal of importance. And thank members of the audience for coming and wanting to learn more about these ideas and the situation of structural and systemic racism more generally. Let me begin by offering a traditional territorial acknowledgement, which is now something customary for those of us certainly working in Canada. The University of Manitoba, where I'm located, is itself located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nations. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. What I'm going to do today is pick up, as I say, on a number of threads that have emerged in the two prior presentations. But specifically, what I want to do is introduce you to some of the work that I've been involved in the context of the Global Consortium on Bigotry and Hate, which is a kind of think tank that was created in 2019 by a number of scholars, activists, curators, and artists who were concerned by the rise of hate, and particularly kind of right-wing totalitarian hate, both locally and globally. So the Global Consortium was the brainchild of Alex Hinton, who is the UNESCO chair, in genocide prevention at Rutgers University, and the project itself, its main home is at Rutgers University, though it's it's a very diasporic group. So what we've done is, starting in 2019, and I will have to admit, in a way that's been thoroughly disrupted by COVID and our attempts to get local experience, as well as enter into these kind of global discussions. If you look at the slide on the left, you'll see that we have partners located in the US, Scandinavia, in Africa, in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and South America. We're doing our best to be open to perspectives from all over the world. And so even though we have kind of point people located in each of these places, represented by the conferences we're expecting to have, and as I say, the timetable is completely skewed now, although I'm hoping to be in Moscow in November this year. What we have is a very open forum within which experts are invited in from across a region when we meet in a particular place. So, for example, when we met in Norway, we did have presentations on right-wing extremism in Norway, particularly Anders Breivik and the kind of fallout from his mass murder of young liberal Democrats there, to the Sami people and the situation of the Sami in the Sami parliament. We've met physically at Rutgers and then again in Norway, but as I say, the rest of the schedule is ongoing. We've been able to meet online, but yeah, we're still struggling to make this work. We're getting back on track as we speak. The first major research output, and I wanted to mention it because it is already being quite impactful, is Alex Hinton's It Can Happen Here, which was published. It just came out in June of this year. And it's subtitled White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the United States. And it's a major attempt to argue that within the American context, somebody like Donald Trump needs to be understood less as the exception and more as the rule. In fact, Alex's argument, and you can see it sort of represented in the quote that I have here, is that Trump has been described, to use Alex's word, as everything from a racist to the second coming of Hitler. While those sorts of characterizations have a grain of truth, they're also dangerous because they misdirect us. If dramatic, Trump's presidency was continuous with a history of systemic white power that dates back to the origins of this country. In other words, Trump was a symptom of this history, not an aberration. And this is a significant argument, partly because what it suggests is that we want to deal with systemic racism in places like the United States, you have to think outside of the moment. You have to understand something about the temporal flows and the human flows that sort of coalesced in the Trump moment, but that had antecedents in many prior moments. One of which, by the way, is echoed in Alex's title. He's referring to the novel by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which, if you don't know the novel, was written in the 1930s and imagines the rise of a populist president who offers all kinds of economic incentives on the back of a platform of racial hate in order to secure his power base. So the echoes are obviously quite significant. The image, I wanted to mention this just because I think it's a great choice. The image on the cover of Alex's book refers to a story he tells in the book, which is a story about a narrative that Donald Trump uses regularly in his or used regularly during his campaign presentations, and it involves a woman who takes a wounded snake into her house. So Trump is there; he's telling this to his legions of fans, and he explains that the wounded snake comes into the house. The woman feeds it, looks after it, loves it, and brings it back to health, after which the snake bites the woman in the hand and she begins to die. And as she's dying, she asks the snake, "How could you do this to me? Why would you bite me? I've been so good to you." And the snake replies, "You knew what I was when you brought me into your house. How could I do otherwise?" right? And of course, the metaphor here is on the one, and you see it's a clever metaphor. On the one hand, it refers to Trump and the fact that we know his character. He's made no secrets about his failings as a human being, and nevertheless, he's somebody who gets invited in. And if it's the fact that he's politically toxic, we knew that when we brought him in. It's part of the reason why he's there. But what Alex is arguing, and this is the interesting point, is every time that story is told, the snake is described as of color. And there's a way in which that snake is the racial other, the other who's been brought into white America, given all of the kind of benefits that white America has to bestow, and then bites the hand that feeds it. And of course, this has been the message taken away by the many hard right hate groups that are in Trump's tail, like the Proud Boys, for example. So this is a kind of white power dog whistle that's used at that was used by Trump at one and the same time. So what we do at each of the meetings is, in addition to having presentations by local experts, we present updates that we call state of hate updates. And so we get a kind of temporal slice of the current state of race relations, hate speech, hate activity, and responses to that from each of the partners in the consortium. And my job, along with my colleague Andrew Wolford, is to present, because we're the collaborate as nodes on the Canadian end, as we try and talk about the Canadian context. And one of the things that we've had to do in explaining Canadian racism, Canadian hate, is acknowledge some real challenges that we face in making generalizations about a place like Canada. And I know this will resonate for others in complicated and very large countries, but it's worth noting because it does mean that any generalizations we offer need to be very carefully qualified if what we're trying to do is create an accurate picture of the state of hate relations, let's call them, in a given place at a particular time. So in the Canadian context, it's important to acknowledge the vastness of the country. And that vastness has a corollary, which is the relative lack of population. For something that is the second largest country on Earth, we have a population of just over 37 million people. And so a population density that's really 0.48 of the world population. It's tiny, with 11 people per square mile, 4 people per square kilometer. Another thing to note about the Canadian case is that when we talk about racism, we're really dealing with like predominantly an urban phenomenon of some kind. Most Canadian people live in urban areas. 81.3% of the population. And additionally, the vast majority of the population, 90% of Canadians, live within about 100 miles distance of the American border. And I know this kind of geography and these distances mean less and less in today's connected world. But at the end of the day, it's difficult to overstate the influence that American cultural politics, and I'm going to say the American way of race and race relations, spills over the border and starts to inflect the way that we start to think about the social dynamics of the Canadian moral and political landscape. So as I say, I mean, there's a great deal of variation in the country, and this variation has implications for the way hate is expressed and experienced. And what we find is that there are, it's better to think in terms of mapping hate. It's better to think in regional terms in the country, because there are some regional consistencies that help mark different parts of the country apart from other parts, insofar as the presence and experience of racism and hate is concerned. So these would be the major regions. We have the Atlantic region, then Quebec, which is predominantly Francophone, Ontario, which is the economic political engine of the country. We have the Prairie provinces, we have the North, and then we have the West. We have the West Coast, which is essentially British Columbia. In each of these areas, partly owing to settlement patterns, partly owing to economics, partly owing to landscape, geography, topography, you get different cultures of hate or subcultures of hate. We see this if we're looking at some of the statistics that we have available to us on the regional variance in the reported incidence of hate crimes between, say, 2016 and 2019. And what you notice, of course, is that there are higher incidents in provinces like Ontario and Quebec at higher rates, right? Not just numbers, but rates. And then you have, in a large province like Alberta, you have a very conservative province like Alberta, you have higher rates. And then, of course, in British Columbia, you have relatively high rates, but in the maritime provinces, you have proportionately less. Another thing that, if we're trying to understand the way racism and hate sort of circulates in this country, and this can be surprising, I think, partly because I think a lot of the more conspicuous examples of hatefulness occur in major metropolitan areas. But if you look at the statistics, and certainly the reported incidences of hate crimes in the country, what we see is it's in fact not the main centers, population centers in the country that contain the greatest numbers of hate acts. It's actually mid-sized Canadian cities. The largest big city that we see on this list from 2019 is Vancouver, followed by Toronto and so forth. And then some of the other large cities further down. But to know that Hamilton, Ontario, which some of you may never have even heard of before as a city, is Canada's leading center of hate can be surprising. And it places an explanatory burden on those of us interested in this phenomena to say why. Like, why is it that it's these smaller centers where we find we find hate? In Vancouver, of course, what we have is a dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate. And if you look at the statistics, again, recent statistics on reported incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes, we see the number in Vancouver actually outstripping Montreal, which is outstripping New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and other places where you might expect to have a greater number of these kinds of crime. And it's not like we didn't see this coming. And maybe I need to also concede at the outset that official statistics are problematic. I and my colleagues, we realize this, that a great deal of hate crime and the experience of racism and hate doesn't get reported, at least reported to the police. And there's different reasons for that as well, having to do, amongst other things, with racism in the police. So we always need to be somewhat circumspect when it comes to statistics like this. But I think we can see, certainly in the image that I'm showing you right now, that by 2019, East and Southeast Asian racism was on the rise in Canada. We can also see, however, that it's anti-Black racism that represents the vast majority of incidents of racism and hate in the country, even when compared with anti-Indigenous hate, which again might be surprising given the relative levels of attention paid to Indigenous issues, Indigenous racism in Canada, as opposed to anti-Black or even anti-Asian or South Asian racism in the country. There is a disproportion there. So what gets people targeted for hate acts? And again, the statistics are revealing. We find, if we look at the most recent data, that in fact race or ethnicity are behind, or concerns or objections to race or ethnicity are behind the majority of hate acts in Canada, followed by religion, and we would presumably include anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in that, although the line between cultural and religious is a fine one, and then sexual orientation, so anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ plus hate is the third major sort of locus of hate activity in the Canadian context. So in terms of what's recently been going on in the country, and I'm going to present this very schematically as a kind of promissory note in the discussion we can have in the Q&A if you want to follow up on any of this. But I think the country this year has been shaken by a number of events in terms of that are significant for those of us interested in mapping patterns of hate and flows of racism and racial violence. This is a distillation of a lot. I know there's more than this, but these are three kind of signal events that have sort of are working to change at least something at the policy level, at the federal policy level. But I think that at the end of the day, we're going to find that's not enough. The first incident occurred in the context of the recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I know you know about, and I won't get into the details of, but partly because I think protests pro and con were global. They happened everywhere and brought people supportive of the Palestinian cause and people supportive of the Israeli cause on the streets and confronting with one another. And when it happened in Canada, as you can see, from this, so I'm going to go here. As you can see in this image here, there was hate speech, there were physical assaults, there was violence, and it affected all those who were participating in these demonstrations. But I think too, in June this year, so relatively recently, just a couple of months ago, there was a horrific hate crime committed when a 20-year-old white Canadian got in a pickup truck and ran down these members of a Muslim family out for an evening walk. They were walking on the side of the street, and he targeted them deliberately and killed them, which was very shocking. This isn't a place where that kind of violence happens all that often, although obviously there are precedents, and obviously there is violence in Canada. We're by no means anything resembling a utopia. And then the third event, and I think there's a lot of ways in which we're still grappling with this event, but it's mobilized a number of interesting and contradictory responses, problematically contradictory responses, has been the discovery of the remains initially of 215 children at an Indian residential school in British Columbia. There have since been other unmarked grave sites discovered at other residential schools. And for those of you who don't know, the residential schools were a major node in the network of genocidal destruction that took place in Canada that were responsible for kind of violent assimilative practice that presented indigeneity as a problem in need of eradication. And so students who went to these, Indigenous students who went to these residential schools were subjected to processes of assimilation and reacculturation that effectively destroyed their relationship to their past and created all kinds of social and psychological effects, including effects relating to the conspicuous degrees of sexual violence against children that occurred in these schools. And the effects were so profound that in Canada, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission struck specifically to look into this history. And it concluded that, in fact, the history was a genocidal history. So as part of that discovery process, we knew that there were unmarked graves. They just hadn't been identified yet. In fact, the final report of the TRC identified up to 4,000 children whose graves we didn't know. We knew roughly where they were, but we didn't know the names of the children in each of the individual graves. Estimates now suggest as high as 10,000 children that we don't know. And this has fueled the genocide debate in Canada in ways that it sort of spilled over on Canada Day, which is our day of national celebration, where statues were toppled and church icons were vandalized and painted red to signify blood. And then obviously there was graffiti and a great deal of protest, specifically trying to encourage more work of repair, to acknowledge the history of the residential schools and settler colonial genocide generally, but also to find these children and link them back to their communities and their families. So what, this is super schematic, and I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but I did want to say that these events have already triggered a number of responses at the local, the provincial, and at the federal level. And my remarks here just deal with the federal response, which was specifically in relation to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and the consistent presence of both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the country, the federal government struck 2 national summits a day apart that took place just last month. The National Summit on Islamophobia took place on July 22nd, ended with a number of recommendations. I'm not going to deal with them in specific form now. I'm happy to talk about them afterwards. What I wanted to note is that a day earlier, there was a National Summit on Anti-Semitism that took place, and the federal commitments were identical coming out of both summits. So whatever the government has chosen to do as an acknowledgement of the ongoing problem of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia seems to acknowledge the structural character of these problems precisely insofar as the solutions to both that it's offering are identical, right? It's going to do the same things for both communities on the understand. And what they're going to do effectively is make more money available, which they've already done. They've committed $6 million immediately to 150 projects, most at the community level, to educate and to provide supports for people who've experienced hate. But frankly, like none of this is enough, nor the work that they're doing to try and identify these children. Partly because, I mean, certainly in the Indigenous case, a lot of that work is backwards looking, and the problems facing Canada's Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous children, are very much of now and the future. And so much less is being invested into now and the future than is being invested into the past, that I think there's just a rebalancing that has to go on at some point in time. Now, I'm going to leave it here, I think, just simply by giving you a kind of down payment on something I haven't fully developed, but my own work coming out of the Global Consortium involves mapping distinct kinds of hate. And the reason, I've got this tripartite model, which I'm beginning to flesh out. My reasons for doing this is that I'm interested in hate prevention. And when I talk about local hate, I'm talking about hate that involves local conditions and local histories. When I talk about diasporic hate, I'm talking about hate in a diasporic locale that's inflected by politics in the homeland. That politics gets transplanted and then reworked locally, but in that reworking, it can actually sometimes be intensified and divorced in signal ways from evolution that takes place back in the homeland. So diasporic hate's its own kind of thing. And then xenophobic hate is fear of the outsider. It's not about, it's not hate directed towards an insider, it's hate directed towards an outsider. And each of these has different well springs, and I'm going to argue, or at least my interest is in arguing, that each of those has different remedies as well, and different things that we need to guard against. So that's what I wanted to say about hate. I understand it wasn't on BLM narrowly, but I'm hoping that there was enough there that intersected with the prior 2 presentations that you felt that it was worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello? Okay, thank you very much to our panelists. And now I think we're going to open the floor to questions, which are going to be put through the chat. I think what I can say about the presentation that we have had from different contexts, different situations, there is one thread that runs and combines all these different contexts that we had today. And it is that structural racism provides with resources, power, opportunity, and access. So whatever the situation is, and you may also turn it around and say, of course, to some certain extent, it is divisive, it marginalizes, it dehumanizes, and that's the thread that runs through these different contexts, although we may see them as different contexts. But for now, we are going to open, while we're waiting for people to put up their questions, I think I'm going to ask one question just as people are thinking of what questions to ask. I think in all the areas, perhaps during the colonial period, even up to now to a certain extent, churches have been on both sides of the issue. You have had churches that were revolutionary, you have had churches that were very anti-progress. How do you see the role of the church as an institution. I mean, having come from Southern Africa, and it was true here in Canada in colonial situations, that during that period of time, over 90% of schools were run by churches. Right? In a situation in Zimbabwe, it was like that, to the extent that you needed to be baptized before you can be accepted in schools. But so it played a very pivotal role during that period of time, and we know what it happened in all colonial areas, whether we are talking about Australia, we're talking about Zimbabwe. So how do you see this institution, which was once very powerful and still in some instances very powerful, playing a role, whether it's in justice and whether in this structural racist kind of situation? You can jump in.
So anyone can jump in, Kim?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So November last year, I did a presentation for the Canadian Council of Churches, and it was, the lecture was part of the CCC's initiative to recognize the United Nations Declaration of the Decade of Independence, the Decade for People of African Descent. And that decade was promulgated in, or news about it in 2014. So 2014 until 2024. Last year was 2020. It was the first time, 6 years after the announcement, that the Canadian Council of Churches decided to recognize the decade for Black people. And so that was noteworthy in, I would say, specifically anti-Black, because you take 6 years to recognize something. At the same time, the federal government, I think it's this year, that recognized the UN designated decade. So churches like the CCC, which is a broad umbrella organization, there are many churches under that umbrella, can not only educate the congregants, but also to inform them. And some of these congregants are people of color, are people from marginalized communities, are equity deserving groups. So they know what the issues are, or most of them. So churches can bring these issues to the fore, to the top of the national agenda, can lobby, if you will, the various governments, the municipality, the province, and the federal government in the case of Canada, as to the issues of human rights, because I think it's also important to frame these issues in the context of human rights. Canada has a charter. So those are some of the responsibilities of the church. Now, with respect to what Professor Muller just talked about, the indigenous children, the church is a Catholic church, and more or less, even though, you know, Anglican and United Church were also involved in running some of these schools, but the 80% of the schools were run by Catholic orders. And so what we see, or at least what I see, is a kind of not a mea culpa from the Catholic Church, but defending themselves against this charge of genocide with respect to indigenous people. So that is really interesting to watch, and having people from indigenous communities, you know, tearing down statues. Some churches have been set on fire, et cetera, et cetera. So the churches do play a role, and we have to sort of counterbalance that against the fact that, at least for many in the white communities, especially in cities, people have stopped going to churches. We now see that many of the churches are now selling their buildings to other religious groups, or to daycare centers, or to other organizations, because many people are simply not going to church, many white people. The Catholic Church, for example, the people who are filling those pews are people from Africa and from the Philippines, for example. So then it becomes even more nuanced because those congregants now have the responsibility to put social justice issue at the top of the agenda. So that is some of the ways I see that the church can take a mighty stand. The issue of the church, again, if you look at Black communities across Canada, Black communities traditionally have had their own churches because Black communities from the start of Canada as a colonial project have Black communities were sort of chased out of the white churches, or they had to sit in the basement or sit at the back with a curtain covering them. And they said to hell with that. And they went and they started their own churches and church institutions. So the Black church has always been a site of social justice for the Black community and for people as a whole. We have to bear that in mind. The Black church in Canada is an old church. It's about 200 years old. Since slavery was abolished in 1834 in Canada and the British Empire, you've had the Black church. But even before that, you've had a Black church that was started by enslaved people. So the Black church in Canada, all across Canada, has played this role of social justice. It's important to bear that in mind. I want to say quickly a point about the federal government calling these two summits recently, a month ago, one on Islamophobia and the other on anti-Semitism. People in the Black community also called on the federal government to have a summit on anti-Black racism. The federal government did not do that. The question is to ask why. Black communities have been at the forefront in this country of social justice agitation, the forefront. Black people have laid down their lives and their bodies to get social justice on the agenda. The whole issue around police accountability was started by Black communities. And we have, on Multiculturalism Day, which was the end of June, I gave a presentation and in which my voice was one of the voices that called to the federal government for a summit on anti-Black racism. Trudeau government ignored us. And so it's interesting that they have sort of said to the Muslim community and the Jewish community, we value you guys, we'll have this summit, we'll pump money into your communities, but not the Black community. Interestingly, that the federal government also is not thinking about intersections, because so many of the people that called for this summit on anti-Islamophobia were Black people. Again, they were at the forefront. So Black people are not just Black people have also other intersections. Black people are also Muslims. And this is one of the issues with the hate crime statistics. Because if I'm a Black person who's a Muslim, goes and report a hate crime, the police only has one box. So they will only tick off, okay, Black woman. And I said, no, I was attacked because I was wearing a headscarf or whatever. They don't have the ability to reflect the intersectionality. So even though the statistic is saying 46% of people who were victims of race crime were Black, it could be 60%. The other 14 could be Black Muslims.
Can I just say, just let me say, absolutely. And I think, in fact, I was aware that a request had gone out for a summit having to do with anti-Black racism as well. And, I think there at least should have been a summit. But actually, if you look at the outcomes of the other two summits, all the signs of haste are all over those outcomes from the federal government. I doubt whether they were serious even with those other communities. But that point I think you made about intersection is super important. It unsettles the statistical frameworks completely, but it also ignores opportunities for solidarity building that are built into the way people are actually living their lives by artificially compartmentalizing them. So we waste resources, we squander opportunities for creating common ground, or at least acknowledging common ground. And the result is that things don't move forward the way that they should. So Afua, I just wanted to say, fantastic. Yeah, I agree with you completely.
Thanks.
Okay, I think questions have started to trick in here, and I'm going to read some of the questions, perhaps directed to specific. This one is a question directed to Dr. Hadebe. Samukele here. Your presentations makes it clear that racism isn't simple, the exclusive work of a selected group of people, or e.g. white people, against targeted groups. In other words, it is a systematic issue that is structured socially, mentally, psychologically, economically, and politically, and so on. So in the context of South Africa, how do you think the systemic racism can be radically reworked in more enduring ways? As you have got access to the question there.
Well, I think it's a very loaded question that would need a whole new panel addressing it, because that's a serious challenge to my host in South Africa, with its history of apartheid and all the crimes that we are associated with. But also, while we acknowledge the efforts done after democracy to try and bridge, I think we should commend those efforts. But still, we realize from the eruptions, it would be too early to assume that all would have been by now attended to, since there are new challenges that are coming in, and from the political, from the social, from the economic, that impinge on the issue of racial relations. But most important, perhaps, it would be to address the inequalities that can be defined on social class lines, but mostly the social class lines also follow the racial divide. So unless, perhaps from where I come from, the labor side, it would be to address the socioeconomic uplifting the majority of the previously disadvantaged communities. And that's not easy, of course, but it can be done by first addressing access to education, which is an issue, if you follow the issues of the fees must fall, roads must fall, movements, all those we're trying to address not only the issue of access to education, but also access to the knowledge production, which is a very big debate. But we also look at issues, basic issues like access to housing, access to clean water, access to energy. All those are challenges that are really serious in that country to really address if one were to move forward. But also looking at the various stakeholders, not just the policy government level, but other non-governmental stakeholders, as we have already talked about, the church, labor I've mentioned, and various stakeholders to do it. But it's a serious challenge, and the violence just in the recent demonstrations or protests where there were serious cases of looting, the racial element came up in one of the areas where there was perhaps a backlash, which was racially targeted. People fine were protecting their property, but it also had those racial undertones. So it's still a very fragile setup, which really needs to be handled with much maturity. Otherwise, it can really become very bad. I think I can end there. Thank you.
I think the next question is directed to Adam, and I mean there's something that is written on top there, but the question is, you talked about Canada's racism spilling over from the United States. What are the implications in your views of how we contextualize the specificities of Canadian forms of anti-Black racism in relation to the United States? Oh.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So it's a great question, Alison. I think at least partly, and I know, I mean, and it's quite complicated, but I think when the vast mass of Canadian people use terms that are racial terms, Blackness, Asian, what have you, they come in a form that's saturated with traces of American cultural history and cultural bias, partly because those terms circulate so readily through mass media that's informed by exactly that same set of values. I find in my students' work, for example, that they often appeal to laws and constitutional clauses that aren't part of Canadian the Canadian legal system at all. They've just borrowed what they think is the way we talk about certain kinds of justice from the way Americans talk about that kind of justice, and they use it and apply it kind of clumsily to the Canadian case. So I think there's a deep question, at least, that I don't have an answer to, but I think it's an important question that really asks the question about whether there is a kind of distinctly Canadian form of Blackness that's rooted in Canadian Black experience as opposed to American Black experience, that overlaps with that experience in signal ways, but that is both helpfully complicating and specific to the experience of people who live in this country, have grown up in this moral and political economy, and the kind of life world that has been cultivated that helps make Canada a distinct not just polity but social formation as well. So I think, insofar as we use these terms and the philosophies and political strategies in which they're enmeshed that have developed in other political and social contexts, they might be, but they may not and shouldn't be presumed to be the best fit for the problems we have here. And so, and as I say, I recognize that there are people working on explaining what Canadian forms of indigeneity are like, for example, what the Asian Canadian experience is like, for example. It's not like this work isn't going on or this is a new concern. But at the end of the day, it's not a widely public concern. And I think that's where we get a problem, that we have interesting thought going on that's particularizing and nuancing, but people still seem to prefer to fall back on pat and largely alien assumptions about what something like Blackness is, that in fact can obscure just as much as it reveals.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think there is a question which I must include before the end, which is on, somebody raised a question on a working definition of inclusion. But I will first of all, and also direct this question to Afua. You mentioned a study early in the presentation. Would you be able to share the name again so I can look it up? But I want to combine this with this other question. Actually, I was just making note of that. I think you have access to some of those questions. This question is about, to you again, your points clearly highlighted the continuation of Black enslavement and dehumanization. My question concerns the vision of freedom, or construed in terms of inclusion, e.g. as implied in the recommendations on your last slide. What's your view about inclusion of Blacks in what exactly, in a Canadian context, and to what extent does inclusion guarantee freedom?
Okay, yeah, sure, thank you for the question. To be included in what? It's a good question. It's a question that I grapple with every day, because my overarching vision is that of freedom for everyone, of freedom for Black people. Black people are part of humanity. Oftentimes when people say it's not just Blacks who are oppressed, I said, no, you're right, but Black people are part of the human race. So inclusion in what? It's a very good question, because is it an inclusion in the neoliberal context in which we live? Is it an inclusion in the capitalist state in which we live? So this is where you have to bring in the political economy. So are Black people gonna be free and then just become Black capitalists, and reinscribe the same kind of, as we would say in Jamaica, the same kinds of ism and schisms that we are now living through? So those are questions we have to ask ourselves. I'm not gonna give an answer. I just want people to ask themselves that. Are we happy with the neoliberal context in which we live? Are we happy with the manner in which the earth is being destroyed, and we might not be on the planet for a long time? The human race could become extinct if we don't implement some of those protocols that we have, signed, the Paris Accord. And I want to put Bolivia in here. In 2010, Evo Morales had a conference in Bolivia, Evo Morales, then president, in which over 30,000 climate activists descended on Bolivia. And they've signed the Pachamama Treaty, the earth having rights, Pachamama, Mama Earth. So are we willing to be included in this situation where our governments have no respect and regard for the environment? And that is people of color who primarily, especially people of African heritage, who are primarily the victims of global warming. Africa, the 54 countries, are responsible for only about 3.4% of, carbon emissions, but have suffered disproportionately. Like we see the desertification in the Sahel, we see flooding in East Africa, we see all these climate refugees, we see Lake Chad shrinking on a daily basis. So what are we fighting to be included in? Individually, we can play our part, but I think a greater action comes, as with the two panelists talk about, being included in organizations, in think tanks that are striving to create a just world, a better world for everyone. If we use a human rights frame, we can always go back to the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedom and say, yes, it's not a bad document, actually. If we read through it, we can see how if it's applied, how it can really lead to more inclusion for everyone. But I urge us as individuals to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. If you're involved in a church or a religious group, ensure that this group has social justice on its agenda, climate justice, racial justice. If you're involved in an academic institution, the way I am, ensure that your institution not just have, nowadays every academic institution, when you go on their website, it says we commit to diversity, justice, and inclusivity, which in many cases is just lip service. Ensure that they follow through. We just did an investigation at Dalhousie University. I led the panel on that, called Lord Dalhousie's History in Connection to Race and Slavery. And there are a number of recommendations that the panel put forth to the university. And it's been difficult trying to get those recommendations implemented. But at the same time, we are determined that the 13 recommendations be implemented. So it is a struggle. The thing that people have to realize, and I know we all realize, is that it's a struggle. It's work. It's work where we use our hands, we use our hearts, we use our brains, we use our intellectual capacities, everything, if we do believe in social and racial justice. But it's a critical question, inclusion in what kind of world are we envisioning? And if it's a world of neoliberalism, it's a world of capitalism, it's a world of climate injustice, then we're still gonna see these various hierarchies of oppression that we're now experiencing today.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end, and I think I'm going to, there are two questions that I would want to put across, and we might run a little bit over some of, the time we've scheduled there. So I'll kind of abuse the friendship I have with the panelists, and then in going over a little bit, and so that we keep it on record. At least it's going to be on record in this particular situation. I would want to address this question. I would want to hear Samukele speak to the issue of the role of the church. You eloquently spoke about, the unions playing this great role, especially in Southern Africa. It's a very interesting scenario, of course, which is duplicated in other places, but that's the most recent one, where churches were on both sides, where you had churches in the liberation groups, where you had churches actually during the Corona period, and it's all over, where we had the Tutus, where we had the Bozaks, and we had a number of people who worked in terms of liberation. And we had schools, which of course did this. I just want to hear what your thinking is about the role of the church in South Africa, in addition to some institutions you have made mention of.
Thank you, Kim. Actually, in Southern Africa, the church has largely been the voice of the voiceless, as it were. And you rightly spell it out that the church has been on both sides, supporting oppression as well as supporting liberation. But as we all know, history does not really worry about collaborators. History worries about those who side with progress. So when we say the church has been the voice of the voiceless, we are counting those instances. It could have been of very few men and women of cloth, but at least whatever contribution they did to stand for justice, it has actually moved society progressively, and we can mention quite a number. But of course, we know the church in our region, dating back to the colonial period, was not immune from the dominant ideology then, which was racist. And the church has not been exonerated from repression by the state. As we know, quite a number of church leaders were victims, were incarcerated, were exiled, some were killed during the struggle for liberation. But by and large, we can say the church has been progressive in this part of the world. For instance, through its provision of services to the public, most importantly, education and health, because most of the hospitals, clinics, and schools in many parts of our region are still church-run, and many people got the basic education they got through the benefit of the church, and we cannot underestimate that contribution under the circumstances. So because of that background, we still have so much hope in what the church can do. We have much hope in its voice. The church in this part of the world still has a very huge following. So whenever the church raises a voice against the establishment, many people do listen and follow. So that way you can say the church still has a role to play, and a positive one. That way, notwithstanding that there are some who still support the establishment, which is not favorable to the majority of people. But we are not worried about that. We should worry about the progressive aspect and amplify the voice of those who are working for social justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps the last question, before I thank the audience. I know some people might be leaving now to go to different places. Thank you very much for attending this conference. It has been very exciting. But this one question, I think the person who asked it is going to stay behind to hear what you are saying. It's one who says, one of the most casual and frequent forms of bigotry is hate speech. I would like to ask the panelists what they think about the relationship between hate speech and free speech. In the academia, there exists also the idea of academic freedom. Do you think free speech and academic freedom can help to challenge structural racism? If so, how? Or do you think they enable structural racism to flourish? I think you've made answer those questions, perhaps just some brief answers to that, since there's our time. To all the panelists, this is addressed to all the panelists.
I think that's Adam's question. He's part of a think tank that engages this question every day.
There you are, Adam. Give it a
Well, you know, I do have, I have a kind of off-the-shelf answer to this, which is probably unsatisfying, and it's cruder than I actually probably would wish to present if I had more time. But I'll say this, that hate speech is illegal. And we don't live in a society that promotes radical freedom of speech. The idea that there should be radical freedom of speech is exactly one of the spillovers we get from the American context, within which this value is fetishized to an almost absurd degree. In the Canadian context, there's legal provision to punish people for using hate speech. So what does this mean in terms of the kind of academic response? Well, I think actually, if I'm honest, as academics aren't overly interested in free speech. We're interested in free thought. We think we should be able to think what we like, but what we're really interested in is smart speech. And so what we end up interested in our sort of stock in trade is less just ideas that come vomited forth than interesting justifications being given to defend specific positions. And those justifications end up being the meat in our kind of political and epistemic sandwich. In other words, what we do is we chew over people's reasons for thinking what they do and saying what they do. That's what we study, critique, and try to realign, right? We're not really in the business to get people to say whatever they think whenever they think it, because there's just not a lot for us to work with that way. I think we're trained to do a particular kind of work. The work is the work of critique, and critique requires justification. And so what we care about is smart speech, not free speech.
Okay, since I think, unless if Afua and Samukele wanted to say something brief about that, I think they have chosen Adam to do that. I think I'll be remiss at the end just to thank our panelists who actually have done a good job. And I just forgot to mention right at the beginning that these are people who have been everywhere in the world, who have enjoyed and lived in all continents. It's very interesting that there is a string that joins all three of them. Experience of Africa, which is kind of very interesting. And I'll be also remiss if I didn't mention the groups that made this webinar possible. The University of Winnipeg, the G20 Interfaith Forum, the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, and the Global College of the University of Winnipeg. And of course, the audience and the panelists made this a very interesting thing. Thank you so much for, to all who attended and participated and raised some of the questions that were actually that made it a very stimulating discussion. We haven't finished this, perhaps we'll continue to do that, and you might be seeing more of our panelists in the future. Thank you.